The morning of April 9th, 2021, dawned quiet and crisp over Windsor Castle. The ancient stone walls that had witnessed centuries of royal history stood silent, unaware that they were about to become the backdrop for one of the most profound moments in modern British monarchy. Inside the private apartments, Queen Elizabeth II sat in her favorite chair, the one Prince Philip had insisted she keep by the window so she could watch the changing seasons in the castle grounds. At 99 years old, Prince Philip had been slowing down noticeably in recent months. The man who had once been the epitome of vigor and energy, who had sailed through storms and walked beside his wife through decades of royal duties, had become increasingly frail. Yet even in his weakened state, he maintained the sharp wit and direct manner that had both charmed and occasionally scandalized the British public for over 7 decades. The Queen had risen early that morning, as was her custom. She dressed simply in a wool skirt and cardigan, her hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. The corgis followed her through the corridors as she made her way to the breakfast room, their soft paws padding against the ancient floors. Everything seemed normal, routine even. The staff went about their morning duties with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized Windsor Castle for generations. Prince Charles had been staying at nearby Highgrove, his beloved country estate, when the call came. The voice on the other end was measured, professional, but Charles detected the underlying tension immediately. His father's condition had taken a sudden turn during the night. The doctors were with him now, but the family should be prepared. Charles felt his stomach drop as he absorbed the words. This was the call he had been dreading for years, yet somehow it still caught him completely off guard. The drive to Windsor Castle felt both endless and far too short. Charles found himself remembering the countless times he had made this journey over the years, usually for family gatherings, state occasions, or simply to visit his parents. Today felt different. The familiar countryside rushing past his window seemed to blur as his mind raced with memories and regrets, conversations he wished he had had, and words he wished he had spoken differently. Inside the castle, the Queen made the silence in the room was broken only by the steady ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece, each second marking the beginning of a new chapter in royal history. Queen Elizabeth II remained seated beside the bed, her hand still resting on Philip's, as if releasing it would make his passing too real to bear. The soft morning light filtering through the windows seemed different somehow, less warm than it had been just hours before. Charles stood behind his mother. The days following Prince Philip's death passed in a carefully orchestrated blend of private grief and public ceremony. Windsor Castle, which had been the Duke's preferred residence, became the center of a nation's mourning. Charles found himself navigating between his roles as grieving son and senior royal, supporting his mother while managing the complex requirements of a state funeral during a global pandemic. The Queen's strength during this period became legendary, even by her own remarkable standards. She insisted on reviewing every detail of the funeral arrangements, determined that the ceremony would reflect Philip's wishes rather than follow traditional royal protocols. When officials suggested a grand procession through London, she firmly declined, pointing out that Philip had specifically requested a simple service at St. George's Chapel. Her word was final, as it always had been, but now it carried the additional weight of a widow's determination to honor her husband's memory properly. Charles spent hours each day with his mother, sometimes discussing practical arrangements, other times simply sitting quietly in her presence. These moments reminded him of his childhood, when he would seek comfort in her calm demeanor during times of uncertainty. Now their roles were partially reversed. While she remained the monarch and head of the family, he had become her primary support system in a way that felt both natural and profound. The international response to Philip's death surprised even seasoned royal observers. Messages poured in from every corner of the globe, not just from heads of state, but from ordinary people whose lives had been touched by Philip's work. The Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme alone had impacted millions of young people worldwide, and their testimonials painted a picture of a man whose influence extended far beyond his royal status. William and Catherine arrived at Windsor with their children on the second day after Philip's death. The presence of the great-grandchildren brought a different energy to the castle, reminding everyone that life continues even in the midst of profound loss. George, at 7 years old, was beginning to understand the significance of what had happened, while Charlotte and Louis were simply aware that the adults around them were sad. The Queen's interaction with her great-grandchildren during this time revealed another layer of her grief. She had often spoken of how much Philip enjoyed watching the children grow up, how he would teach them games and tell them stories about his own childhood. Now those future moments were gone, and she felt the loss not just for herself, but for the generations that would never know the man who had shaped the modern royal family. Harry's return to England created its own set of challenges. The media attention was intense, with every photograph and gesture analyzed for signs of reconciliation or continued tension within the family. Charles made the decision to house Harry at Frogmore Cottage, his former residence, rather than in the main castle, understanding that some distance might be beneficial for everyone involved. The reunion between the brothers was awkward initially, but the shared grief over their grandfather's death began to bridge the gap that had opened between them. Philip had always been fond of both boys, and they found common ground in sharing memories of their times with him. The healing was tentative and incomplete, but it was a start, and took charge of many of the practical arrangements, her no-nonsense approach proving invaluable during the complex planning process. She worked closely with the military officials organizing the ceremonial aspects, ensuring that every detail reflected Philip's naval background and personal preferences. Her efficiency and attention to detail reminded everyone of her father, and the Queen relied on her heavily during these difficult days. The decision to limit the funeral attendance to 30 people due to COVID-19 restrictions was particularly challenging. The guest list had to be carefully crafted to include close family members while respecting public health guidelines. Foreign dignitaries who would normally be expected to attend had to watch remotely, a modern reality that Philip, with his interest in technology and innovation, might have found fascinating. Edward and Sophie proved to be steady anchors during the planning process, taking on many of the communication responsibilities with various organizations that Philip had patronized. The Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, the World Wildlife Fund, and dozens of other charities needed to coordinate their own memorial activities while respecting the family's wishes for privacy. The Queen's daily routine became a source of stability for everyone at Windsor. She continued her constitutional duties, reading state papers and conducting necessary meetings, but she also made time for personal reflection. Charles often found her in the castle gardens, walking among the flowers that Philip had helped design over the decades. These gardens had been one of his passions, and they provided a living memorial to his love of nature and conservation. The media coverage of the mourning period was intense, but generally respectful. Philip had had a complicated relationship with the press throughout his life, sometimes charming journalists with his wit, other times shocking them with inappropriate comments. Now, however, the coverage focused on his decades of service and his role as the Queen's steadfast companion. One of the most touching aspects of the public response was the number of people who shared stories about personal encounters with Philip. Veterans recalled his genuine interest in their service. Young people remembered his encouragement during Duke of Edinburgh award ceremonies, and conservationists praised his early recognition of environmental issues. These testimonials painted a picture of a man who, despite his sometimes gruff exterior, genuinely cared about the people he met. The planning for the funeral itself became an intricate balance of tradition and innovation. Philip's love of technology was reflected in the decision to live-stream the service, allowing millions of people around the world to participate virtually. The music was carefully chosen to reflect both his Greek heritage and his adopted British identity, including pieces that had special meaning to the couple throughout their marriage. Charles found himself thinking often about the conversations he had had with his father in recent years. Philip had been preparing him for this moment, offering advice about supporting the Queen during her widowhood and managing the transition that would inevitably come. The practical guidance proved invaluable now, but Charles missed the opportunity to ask follow-up questions or seek clarification on complex issues. The night before the funeral, the family gathered for a private dinner at Windsor Castle. The conversation was subdued but warm, filled with memories and stories about Philip's life. The Queen spoke about their early years together, when they were simply Elizabeth and Philip, before the weight of the crown had changed everything. These personal reminiscences reminded everyone present that beneath the royal titles was a love story that had lasted more than 7 decades. The morning of the funeral dawned bright and clear, with spring flowers blooming throughout the Windsor estate. The weather seemed to reflect Philip's own approach to life, straightforward, uncomplicated, and beautiful in its simplicity. The family dressed in black, with military medals and family jewelry providing the only touches of color or decoration. The service itself was a masterpiece of understated elegance. The Queen sat alone in the chapel, a poignant image of widowhood that would become one of the defining photographs of the entire period. Her solitary figure, masked and maintaining perfect composure despite her grief, embodied the dignity and strength that had characterized her entire reign. Charles delivered the only eulogy, speaking about his father's devotion to duty, his love for the Queen, and his impact on countless lives around the world. He managed to capture Philip's complex personality, his humor, his dedication, his occasional difficulty, and his unwavering loyalty to the monarchy. The words were carefully chosen, but clearly heartfelt, reflecting both public admiration and private love. The committal service was private, attended only by the immediate family. As Philip's coffin was lowered into the vault beneath St. George's Chapel, each family member said their final goodbye in their own way. The Queen remained composed throughout, but those closest to her could see the enormous effort this composure required. The reception following the service was small and intimate, more like a family gathering than a state occasion. Stories were shared, photographs were passed around, and, for a few hours, the royal family was simply a family dealing with loss like any other. These moments of normalcy were precious, providing a brief respite from the public nature of their grief. As the day ended and family members began to depart, Charles remained at Windsor with his mother. The castle felt different now, forever changed by Philip's absence. The man who had been its driving force for so many decades was gone, but his influence would continue to shape both the building and the family that called it home. The Queen faced the challenge of redefining her role and her daily routine without the companion who had been at her side for most of her adult life. Charles understood that his own responsibilities were expanding, not just as heir to the throne but as the senior male member of a family that was learning to function without its patriarch. The mourning period would officially last several weeks, but the real process of adjustment would take much longer. The royal family had lost not just Philip the Duke of Edinburgh, but Philip the husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. His legacy would live on in the institutions he had shaped, the people he had influenced, and the family he had helped raise. But his physical absence left a void that could never be completely filled. Windsor Castle settled into its new routine as evening approached, its ancient walls once again adapting to change as they had for nearly 1,000 years. The Queen retired to her private apartments, beginning the first night of a widowhood that would last for the remainder of her reign. Outside, the flowers left by well-wishers continued to accumulate, a colorful tribute to a man who had preferred simplicity but had earned the nation's profound respect and gratitude. His own grief momentarily set aside as he recognized the enormous burden that had just settled on his shoulders. He was no longer simply the heir to the throne. He was now the senior male member of the royal family, the one who would need to guide them all through the difficult days ahead. His mother, despite her legendary strength, was now a widow, and the weight of that reality hung heavy in the room. The first practical decisions needed to be made immediately. The royal household had protocols for this moment that had been refined over centuries, but implementing them in the raw aftermath of loss required a delicate balance of efficiency and respect. Sir Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, had been quietly notified and was already coordinating with other senior officials. The Prime Minister would need to be informed, as would the Governors General of the Commonwealth realms and other heads of state around the world, and was the first to speak, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. She had always been the most pragmatic of the Queen's children, the one most likely to focus on what needed to be done rather than dwelling on emotions. She suggested that they allow their mother some private time with their father before the necessary arrangements began. The family quietly filed out of the room, leaving the Queen alone with Philip for what would be their final moments together. In the adjoining sitting room, the siblings found themselves in an unusual position. Throughout their lives, their parents had been the constants, the ones who made decisions and provided guidance. Now, with their father gone and their mother beginning a period of deep mourning, they would need to step forward in ways they never had before. The responsibility felt overwhelming, particularly for Charles, who understood that his role was about to expand dramatically. The Queen's dresser, Angela Kelly, appeared quietly in the doorway. She had served the Queen for decades and understood better than most the personal side of royal life. Without speaking, she communicated that the Queen would need privacy to change clothes and compose herself before the day's necessary activities began. The black outfits that had been carefully maintained for this eventuality would need to be pressed and prepared, not just for the Queen but for the entire family. Edward found himself thinking about the children, his own and those of his siblings. How do you explain to young minds that the grandfather who had been teaching them to sail and telling them stories about his naval adventures was gone? George, Charlotte, and Louis would need to be told gently, in age-appropriate ways that helped them understand the magnitude of the loss without overwhelming them with grief. The castle staff moved with quiet efficiency, understanding their roles in the complex choreography that would follow. Footmen began discreetly drawing curtains and adjusting lighting in the staterooms that would soon need to accommodate official visitors. The chef started planning menus for the stream of dignitaries who would come to pay their respects. Every detail mattered, not just out of respect for Philip's memory, but because the world would be watching how the royal family handled this transition. Charles excused himself to make several phone calls from a private office. The first was to William, who needed to understand that his role as second in line to the throne would now carry additional weight. The conversation was brief, but emotional. William had adored his grandfather, and the news hit him hard. Catherine, pregnant with their third child, would need extra support during this difficult time. The second call was more complicated. Harry was in California, and the time difference meant it was still the middle of the night there. The call went to voicemail, and Charles left a simple message asking his younger son to call back urgently. The ongoing tensions in the family made everything more difficult, but grief has a way of putting petty disagreements into perspective. Back in Philip's room, the Queen sat quietly, sometimes speaking aloud as if he could still hear her. She told him about her plans for the funeral, knowing he would want it to be relatively simple despite his royal status. He had always preferred practicality to pomp, and she was determined to honor that preference even as the nation demanded a ceremony worthy of his decades of service. The royal physicians completed their examination and certification, a process that was both medical necessity and constitutional requirement. The cause of death would be listed as old age, a simple phrase that seemed inadequate to describe the end of such a remarkable life. Dr. Douglas Glass, who had been caring for Philip in his final months, spoke privately with Charles about his father's peaceful passing, assuring him that Philip had not suffered. Sophie, Edward's wife, proved invaluable during these early hours. Her background in public relations, from before her marriage, gave her an understanding of how news would spread and what the public reaction might be. She worked quietly with the press secretary to ensure that when the announcement was made, it would be dignified and appropriate. The statement would be simple. It is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. The Queen emerged from her private time looking composed but changed. Those who knew her well could see the profound sadness in her eyes, but her public mask was already in place. She had been preparing for this moment her entire adult life, understanding that as the monarch, her private grief would always be secondary to her public duties. Yet today, Charles was determined that she would have space to mourn as a wife, not just as a queen. Andrew arrived later in the morning, having traveled from his residence at Royal Lodge. His relationship with his parents had been complicated by recent scandals, but today none of that mattered. He was simply a son who had lost his father, and the Queen embraced him without reservation. Philip had always maintained that family troubles should be handled privately, within the family, and that principle guided their interactions now. The practical arrangements began to take shape throughout the morning. The funeral would be held at St. George's Chapel within Windsor Castle, not Westminster Abbey, as might be expected for someone of Philip's rank. This was at his specific request. He had always preferred Windsor to the more formal atmosphere of London. The guest list would be limited due to COVID-19 restrictions, a reality that added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Charles found himself in consultation with military officials about the ceremonial aspects of the funeral. Philip had served in the Royal Navy with distinction, and that service would be reflected in every detail of his final journey. The naval connections were particularly important to Philip's identity. He had often said that his years in the Navy had been among the happiest of his life, before duty to the crown had required him to give up active service. The Queen's corgis seemed to sense the change in the household atmosphere. They stayed closer to her than usual, as if understanding that she needed their comfort. Philip had never been particularly fond of the dogs, often joking about their constant presence, but he had tolerated them because they brought his wife joy. Now they would be one of her primary sources of comfort in the lonely days ahead. Messages of condolence began arriving from around the world as news of Philip's death spread. World leaders, many of whom had met Philip during state visits over the decades, shared memories of his sharp wit, his dedication to environmental causes, and his unwavering support for the Queen. President Biden's message was particularly touching, referencing Philip's service during World War II and his decades of public duty. The Commonwealth realms each had their own protocols for responding to the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. Flags would fly at half-mast, official mourning periods would be declared, and memorial services would be planned in capitals from Ottawa to Canberra. Philip had always taken special interest in the Commonwealth, seeing it as one of Britain's most positive contributions to the modern world. As afternoon approached, Charles realized that his mother had barely eaten anything all day. He arranged for a simple meal to be served in her private sitting room, understanding that the coming days would be physically and emotionally demanding. The Queen would need to maintain her strength for the challenges ahead, including the inevitable public appearances that her role would require. The family began to gather again in the early evening, this time to discuss practical matters. The funeral arrangements needed to be finalized, media statements had to be approved, and decisions made about which royal duties could be postponed or canceled during the official mourning period. It was during this discussion that Harry finally called back from California, having received Charles's message. The conversation between father and son was emotional and difficult. Harry's decision to step back from royal duties had created a rift that had yet to fully heal, but Philip's death put everything into perspective. Harry would fly back to England for the funeral, leaving Meghan, who was pregnant, in California. The reunion would be the first time he had seen his family since the explosive Oprah interview had aired just weeks earlier. The Queen retired early that evening, exhausted by the day's events, but knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Charles remained at Windsor, understanding that his presence provided comfort not just to his mother but to the entire household. The castle staff, many of whom had worked there for decades, were grieving too. Philip had been a constant presence in their working lives, and his passing marked the end of an era for all of them. As night fell over Windsor Castle, the building settled into an unusual quiet. The tourists and well-wishers who had begun gathering at the gates during the day had mostly dispersed, but flowers and tributes continued to accumulate. The sight of people leaving personal messages and small mementos was a reminder that Philip's death was not just a private family loss, but a moment of national mourning. The Queen lay in the bed she had shared with Philip for so many years, now feeling impossibly large and empty. Sleep would be elusive, but she found comfort in planning the details of his funeral, ensuring it would reflect the man he had been rather than the titles he had held. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight was for remembering and grieving in private, aimed her composure with the same grace she had shown throughout her reign. She sat beside Philip's bed, holding his weathered hand in hers. They had been married for 73 years, and in that time, they had rarely been apart for more than a few weeks. She thought about their wedding day at Westminster Abbey, how young and nervous they had both been. Philip had been so handsome in his naval uniform, and she had felt like the luckiest woman in the world. The medical team worked quietly around them, checking monitors and adjusting medications. Doctor after doctor had come and gone over the past few hours, each offering the same careful, measured updates. Philip was comfortable, they assured her. He was not in pain. But the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air like morning fog over the Thames, and arrived first, her car pulling up to the private entrance with practiced discretion. As the only daughter, and perhaps the child most like Philip in temperament, she had always shared a special bond with her father. She walked through the castle corridors with the same no-nonsense efficiency that characterized everything she did, but those who knew her well could see the worry etched in the lines around her eyes. Edward and Sophie followed shortly after, having made the drive from their home in Surrey. Edward, the youngest of the Queen's children, had often felt overshadowed by his older siblings, but Philip had always made time for him. Some of Edward's fondest memories were of sailing with his father in the waters around the Isle of Wight, just the two of them, discussing everything from naval history to the future of the monarchy. Andrew's arrival was more complicated. The scandal surrounding his association with Jeffrey Epstein had effectively ended his public role, and family gatherings had become awkward affairs. But today, none of that mattered. Today, he was simply a son coming to say goodbye to his father. The Queen had insisted that all her children be present, regardless of their current circumstances. Family was family, especially at times like this. When Charles finally arrived at Windsor, he was struck by how normal everything appeared from the outside. Tourists still gathered at the gates, hoping for a glimpse of royal life. The guards maintained their posts with the same stoic professionalism they had shown for centuries. But inside, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation and grief. He found his mother exactly where he expected her to be, sitting beside his father's bed. Philip looked smaller than Charles remembered, diminished somehow by age and illness. But his eyes were still alert, still holding that spark of intelligence and mischief that had defined him for so long. When he saw Charles, Philip managed a weak smile. The conversation that followed was quiet and private, but it covered ground that had been left unexplored for too many years. Father and son spoke about duty, about the weight of the crown that would one day rest on Charles's head, and about the sacrifices that royal life demanded. Philip, ever practical, offered advice about supporting the Queen in the difficult days ahead. He spoke about the importance of putting the institution before personal desires, a lesson he had learned the hard way during his own adjustment to royal life. As the afternoon wore on, more family members arrived. William and Catherine drove down from London with the children, who were kept in a separate wing of the castle but told that grandfather was very ill. Harry, who had recently stepped back from royal duties and moved to California, was not present. The ongoing rift in the family meant that this moment of unity was incomplete, a fact that weighed heavily on everyone's minds. The Queen barely left Philip's side throughout the day. Staff members brought her tea and small meals, most of which went untouched. She spoke to him quietly, sharing memories of their life together, reminding him of holidays in Scotland, state visits to far-off countries, and quiet moments stolen between official duties. Sometimes he would squeeze her hand in response. Other times he simply listened with his eyes closed. As evening approached, the family gathered in the sitting room adjacent to Philip's bedroom. The mood was somber, but not without moments of warmth. They shared stories about Philip's legendary sense of humor, his sometimes inappropriate comments that had kept them all on their toes during public events, and his unwavering dedication to his charitable work, and recalled his passion for the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, how proud he had been of the millions of young people who had participated over the decades. Charles found himself thinking about his own relationship with his father, how it had evolved over the years from the formal distance of his childhood to a deeper understanding in recent decades. Philip had been a product of his generation, not given to emotional displays or lengthy heart-to-heart conversations. But his love for his family had always been evident in his actions, in his fierce protection of the Queen, and in his dedication to preparing his eldest son for the role that awaited him. The doctors continued their quiet ministrations throughout the evening, but It was clear that Philip was nearing the end. The family took turns sitting with him, each saying their private goodbyes. The Queen remained constant, her presence a source of comfort not just for Philip but for the entire family. She was the anchor they all relied on, the steady center around which the monarchy revolved. As the night deepened, Windsor Castle seemed to hold its breath. The ancient walls had witnessed the deaths of kings and queens, the births of future monarchs, and countless moments of joy and sorrow. Tonight, they would witness the passing of a man who had never been king, but who had shaped the modern monarchy more than perhaps any other individual. Philip's breathing became increasingly labored as the early hours of the morning approached. The family remained close, understanding that the end was near. The Queen continued to hold his hand, whispering words of love and comfort. In those final moments, surrounded by family, and in the place he had called home for so many years, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, closed his eyes for the last time. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Then, slowly, the Queen leaned forward and kissed her husband's forehead one final time. Charles moved to stand behind his mother's chair, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. The weight of what had just happened began to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. Outside, Windsor Castle continued to stand as it had for nearly 1,000 years, but everything had changed. An era had ended, and the British monarchy would never be quite the same. The man who had walked 2 steps behind the Queen for over 7 decades, who had been her constant companion and greatest support, was gone. The morning had begun.